My church leader spent 20 years using my confessions as sermon material, while the congregation called it divine inspiration, so I gave him the one confession he couldn't monetize. Pastor Whitmore baptized me at 13 when I confessed I'd been shoplifting makeup to feel pretty after kids called me ugly at school. 2 weeks later, his Sunday sermon centered on a young girl who stole cosmetics to hide her God-given beauty, finding redemption through confession. The congregation wept. Donations tripled that month. I sat in the third row watching him use my shame to fill his offering plates. When I told my mother I recognized my own story in his words, she said I should feel honored that my testimony could inspire others. The pattern started that Sunday and never stopped for 2 decades. Every vulnerable moment I shared in his office became content for his growing platform. My eating disorder at 16 became his viral sermon about a teenager starving herself because society valued thinness over godliness. My sexual assault at 19 became his book chapter about a college student who dressed immodestly and learned about consequences. He changed enough details that nobody recognized me, but I knew. Every word I'd sobbed into his tissue box reappeared polished and packaged for his audience of thousands. The church grew from 200 members to 4,000 during those years. His books sold millions. His conference speaking fees reached 6 figures. And I kept confessing because he convinced me that sharing my pain was ministry, that my suffering had purpose in his hands. My best friend Olivia died in a car accident when we were 23, and I confessed to Pastor Whitmore that I'd been driving that night. I'd run a red light while texting. The guilt was destroying me, and he held my hands while I wept, promising that confession brought healing. 3 months later, his sermon series on a woman whose reckless driving killed her best friend became his most successful yet. He turned my trauma into a 5-part series with workbook materials sold separately. The church bookstore couldn't keep them in stock. I watched him sign copies after service while people praised his raw honesty and divine insight. When I confronted him privately, asking if he'd used my confession about Olivia, he looked confused. "God gives me these stories," he said. "If it resonates with your experience, that's confirmation you're not alone in your struggle." He made me feel crazy for recognizing my own life in his words. The elders praised his anointing. The congregation called him prophetic. My mother said I was being prideful, thinking my small life could inspire his great ministry. So I stayed silent and kept confessing because I'd been trained since 13 to believe that my pain only mattered if he could transform it into something beautiful. At 28, I married Derek in our church with Pastor Whitmore officiating. I'd confessed to him months earlier that Derek had anger issues, that he'd punched a wall during an argument, that I was scared sometimes. Pastor Whitmore counseled me that marriage was a covenant, that my faith could change Derek, that I needed to submit more fully. The wedding was beautiful. 6 months later, Derek broke my arm during a fight about dinner. I went to Pastor Whitmore's office with my cast, begging for help to leave safely. He prayed over me for an hour, saying God hated divorce, that I needed to examine what I was doing to provoke Derek's reactions. His next sermon series was titled, "When Love Hurts, Finding God in Difficult Marriages." He spoke about a young wife whose stubbornness drove her husband to violence, how she learned to soften her heart and save her marriage through submission. The congregation gave him a standing ovation. Women lined up after service to thank him for addressing hard truths. I sat in that third row with my broken arm in a sling, listening to him twist my domestic violence into a lesson about wifely obedience. My mother hugged me afterward, saying how blessed I was to have such wise pastoral care. Derek's violence escalated over the next 3 years. I documented everything in journals I hid in my car, taking photos of bruises, recording his threats. Every time I went to Pastor Whitmore, he counseled patience and prayer. Every time my suffering appeared in his sermons, stripped of urgency and repackaged as spiritual growth opportunity. His book, Beauty from Ashes, Testimonies of Transformed Pain, featured a chapter unmistakably based on my marriage, painting Derek's abuse as sanctification through trial. The book hit the New York Times bestseller list. Pastor Whitmore's speaking tour sold out venues across the country. He appeared on Christian television networks, sharing anonymous testimonies that were detailed enough for me to recognize but vague enough that he maintained plausible deniability. The church building expanded twice during this period. His salary increased to $400,000 annually according to the financial reports buried in church meeting minutes. Meanwhile, Derek broke 3 of my ribs, and I had nowhere to go because Pastor Whitmore had convinced my entire support system that leaving would be spiritual failure. At 31, I finally left Derek after he choked me unconscious. I moved into a women's shelter 2 hours away, filing for divorce despite knowing it would cost me my church community. Pastor Whitmore called me repeatedly, leaving voicemails about reconciliation and forgiveness. I blocked his number. 4 months later, his sermon series, Prodigal Wives, When Women Abandon Their Calling, premiered to his largest congregation yet. He spoke about a woman who selfishly destroyed her marriage by refusing to work through difficulties, who chose worldly independence over godly submission. The implication was clear to anyone who knew I'd left Derek. My mother called crying, saying the church was praying for my repentance. Former friends sent messages about concern for my soul. Pastor Whitmore posted on social media about broken families and the destruction caused by feminist ideology infiltrating the church. His post went viral with 50,000 shares. I watched him profit from my escape from abuse while painting me as the villain in his narrative. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. He'd built his empire on my pain, and when I finally chose survival, he used even that against me. The divorce finalized, and I started therapy with a secular counselor who immediately identified the spiritual abuse I'd endured alongside Derek's physical violence. Dr. Brennan explained how Pastor Whitmore had weaponized my trust, using my confessions not for pastoral care, but for content creation. She helped me see that I'd been groomed since age 13 to believe my suffering only had value if filtered through his platform. The realization broke something fundamental in my understanding of the past 20 years. I'd given him everything, and he'd built a multimedia empire on the foundation of my trauma. His net worth was estimated at $8 million. His church owned properties across 3 states. His books filled shelves in Christian bookstores nationwide. And I was starting over in a studio apartment with a restraining order against my ex-husband and no community because speaking truth cost me everyone who mattered. I started researching Pastor Whitmore's sermons systematically, watching recordings, reading transcripts, cross-referencing with my own memories. The pattern was undeniable. His entire ministry was built on mining vulnerable confessions for marketable content. I found Rebecca through a support group for people leaving high-control religious environments. She'd attended our church 5 years ago, and when she described a sermon about a woman's abortion regret, I knew immediately it was based on her confession to Pastor Whitmore. She'd been 19, pressured by her boyfriend, devastated afterward. Pastor Whitmore had counseled her, prayed with her, then used her story without permission in his Culture of Death sermon series that became his highest-earning conference talk. Rebecca had left the church feeling exposed and violated when people approached her afterward, somehow knowing it was her story despite his supposed anonymization. She'd thought she was alone in recognizing her life in his sermons. Learning I had the same experience was validation and horror simultaneously. We started comparing notes, creating a spreadsheet of sermons matched to confessions we could verify. The exploitation pattern went back 25 years, predating even my involvement. Every crisis in his congregation became content for his platform. He was a predator dressed in pastoral robes, and we'd been conditioned to thank him for consuming us. Through Rebecca's network, we found 11 other women with identical experiences. Danielle's postpartum depression became his sermon series on maternal failure. Kimberly's miscarriage became his book chapter on trusting God's timing. Veronica's financial bankruptcy became his teaching series on poor stewardship. Each woman could identify specific sermons, books, or conference talks built directly from her most vulnerable confessions. Each had been told she was being used by God when she questioned the similarities. The total revenue Pastor Whitmore generated from content based on our collective trauma exceeded $15 million. We formed a private online group, documenting everything with timestamps, recordings, transcripts, and our personal journals from the periods our stories were exploited. The evidence was overwhelming. Pastor Whitmore had built his career systematically mining his congregants' pain for profit, while providing harmful counsel that kept them vulnerable and confessing. The women's shelter director I'd stayed with connected us with a journalist named Melissa, who specialized in religious abuse investigations. She spent 2 months verifying our accounts, interviewing additional sources, obtaining financial records. Pastor Whitmore announced his largest sermon series yet that fall, titled Confessions of a Transformed Heart. The promotional materials promised unprecedented rawness and authenticity. Pre-orders for the accompanying book exceeded 100,000 copies. The church scheduled extra services to accommodate anticipated crowds. His social media team built massive buzz with countdown posts and teaser quotes. I watched the marketing machine operate with clinical detachment, knowing exactly what was coming. He would mine more pain, package more trauma, profit from more vulnerable confessions extracted under the guise of pastoral care. This was his pattern, his business model, his entire ministry foundation. The church leadership protected him fiercely, viewing any criticism as attacking God's anointed. The congregation revered him as especially gifted with insight into the human heart. Nobody questioned where his stories came from because they wanted to believe in divine inspiration rather than calculated exploitation. My therapist warned me that exposing him could trigger retaliation. I didn't care anymore. 20 years of silence had cost me everything already. I scheduled a confession appointment with Pastor Whitmore under the pretense of seeking spiritual guidance about anger and unforgiveness. His assistant confirmed the meeting for the following afternoon in his private office. I prepared meticulously, reviewing my documentation, testing my recording equipment, rehearsing my approach. This needed to be perfect. I arrived at the church during the quiet hours between services, passing the building fund thermometer showing $3 million raised toward the new worship center. Pastor Whitmore's office occupied the entire 3rd floor of the administrative building with panoramic windows overlooking the sprawling campus. His assistant offered me coffee and homemade cookies before ushering me inside. Pastor Whitmore greeted me warmly, commenting that he'd been praying for me, that he was glad I'd reached out. The recording device hidden in my purse captured every word. He settled into his leather chair behind his custom mahogany desk. Books bearing his name lined the shelves. Awards decorated the walls. I sat in the same chair where I'd sobbed at 13, at 16, at 19, at 23, offering my pain to a man who'd commodified my suffering. I need to confess something, I said. I've been carrying rage that's consuming me. I need pastoral guidance. Pastor Whitmore nodded encouragingly, pulling out his leather journal where he always took notes during confessions. I'd seen that journal for 20 years without understanding it was his content mining notebook. Tell me everything, he said gently. This is a safe space. God can handle your anger. I took a breath, centering myself. I'm angry because I've realized someone I trusted has been exploiting me for decades, someone who positioned himself as a spiritual authority while systematically using my trauma for personal profit, someone who gave harmful counsel that kept me in danger so he'd have better stories to tell. Pastor Whitmore's expression shifted slightly. That's heavy. Let's pray about identifying this person so you can confront them. I shook my head. I'm confessing to you that the person is you. That for 20 years you've taken every vulnerable thing I've shared and turned it into sermon content without my consent. That your entire ministry is built on mining confessions for marketable material. That you're a predator who weaponizes spiritual authority. The silence stretched. Pastor Whitmore's face cycled through confusion, recognition, calculation. I think you're mistaken, he finally said. God gives me stories. If you see yourself in my sermons, that's because the Holy Spirit is speaking to universal experiences. His voice remained calm, pastoral, but his grip tightened on his journal. I have documentation, I said. 20 years of journals cross-referenced with your sermon transcripts, dates, details, direct quotes. The shoplifting confession at 13 that became your breakthrough sermon 2 weeks later. Olivia's death that became your best-selling series. Derek's abuse that you turned into that book chapter blaming me for his violence. I can match every major sermon and book chapter to specific confessions from me or other women in this church. Pastor Whitmore stood, moving toward his window. You're clearly struggling with some delusions. I think the divorce damaged you more than we realized. We should discuss getting you proper mental health care. The gaslighting was automatic, reflexive. He'd perfected this response over decades of protecting his empire. I pulled out my folder, laying printed transcripts across his desk. Here's your sermon from October 2012 about a girl shoplifting makeup. Here's my journal entry from September 2012 describing that exact confession to you. Here's your 2016 book chapter about reckless driving. Here's my therapy notes about confessing Olivia's death to you 3 months before publication. Pastor Whitmore sat back down, his pastoral facade cracking. Even if there are similarities, that doesn't mean I deliberately used your stories. God works in mysterious ways. Your experiences might have informed my preaching subconsciously, but that's how the Holy Spirit operates. I leaned forward. I have 11 other women with identical documentation. Postpartum depression, miscarriage, bankruptcy, sexual assault. Everyone can prove you took their confessions and turned them into profit-generating content. We have financial records showing you've made $15 million from material based on our trauma. We have recordings of your harmful counsel that kept us vulnerable. We have everything, and we're going public. His face went pale. For the first time in 20 years, I saw fear in his eyes instead of practiced compassion. You can't do this, he said quietly. It'll destroy the church. Think of all the people who've been helped by these messages. Think of the families, the changed lives. You'd ruin all that because of your hurt feelings? I smiled. I'm not ruining anything. You did that by building your ministry on exploitation. I'm just making sure everyone knows where your divine inspiration actually comes from. This confession I'm giving you right now, the one about exposing your pattern of predatory behavior, you can't monetize this. There's no way to turn it into a sermon without admitting everything. Pastor Whitmore's hands shook as he reached for his phone. I need to call my lawyer. I stood. Go ahead. We already have one. Melissa Rivers from the Tribune is publishing her investigation next Sunday. She has all our documentation, plus interviews with your former assistant who kept copies of your confession notes, plus financial records showing how your revenue correlates directly with traumatic confessions. The article details 25 years of systematic exploitation. Your board of elders received advance copies this morning along with formal complaints. Your publisher has been notified. The women's advocacy groups are prepared to issue statements. This is happening regardless of what you do now. Pastor Whitmore looked destroyed, his carefully constructed image crumbling in real time. I helped you, he whispered. I was there for you when nobody else was. The delusion was astonishing. You exploited me, I corrected. You took a 13-year-old's shame and turned it into your career breakthrough. You counseled me to stay with a man who broke my bones because my suffering made better content than my safety. You built everything on our pain, and you did it deliberately. His journal sat on the desk between us, filled with notes from decades of confessions, evidence of his predatory mining operation. I photographed it with my phone before leaving. He didn't try to stop me. The Tribune article published that Sunday morning while Pastor Whitmore's church prepared for service. The headline read, Divine Inspiration or Exploitation. Megachurch Pastor Built Empire on Congregants' Confessions. Melissa's investigation was thorough and devastating, featuring testimony from 14 women, financial analysis, and expert commentary from trauma psychologists and clergy abuse specialists. She'd obtained internal documents showing Pastor Whitmore's content strategy explicitly included mining confession sessions for sermon material. His notes literally categorized our traumas by marketability potential. The article went viral within hours. National news outlets picked up the story by afternoon. Pastor Whitmore canceled services, releasing a statement through his lawyer about taking time for prayer and reflection. The church board called an emergency meeting. His publisher suspended book contracts. Conference venues canceled appearances. The financial empire built on our suffering began collapsing under the weight of documented truth. My mother called, voice tight. "You've destroyed him. Everything he built. Everything he did for God's kingdom. Was your revenge worth that?" I hung up without responding. Some people would never see the truth, too invested in the mythology to accept reality. Rebecca organized a support group for the women involved in the exposé. We met at a coffee shop across town from the church campus, sharing our experiences of going public, processing the aftermath together. Danielle had been contacted by 3 other women from the church who recognized their own stories in Pastor Whitmore's sermons after reading the article. The pattern was even larger than we'd documented. Veronica's family had stopped speaking to her for participating in the investigation, calling her a liar destroying God's work. Kimberly received death threats from church members on social media. The backlash was intense from people whose worldview depended on Pastor Whitmore being anointed, rather than predatory. But we also received hundreds of messages from people in other churches recognizing similar dynamics with their own pastors. The conversation we'd started extended beyond our specific situation. Other journalists began investigating similar cases. The broader system of pastoral exploitation was being examined publicly for the first time. Our collective decision to speak truth had created space for others to do the same. The cost was real, but so was the impact. The church board placed Pastor Whitmore on indefinite leave while conducting an internal investigation. His salary continued during the review period, protected by his employment contract. The associate pastors led services with significantly reduced attendance. Donations dropped 60% in the first month. The building fund was frozen. Staff layoffs followed. Members I'd known for years posted defenses of Pastor Whitmore on social media, claiming we were deceived by Satan, that the successful always face persecution. They organized prayer vigils for his restoration. A faction split from the church entirely, renting space to continue following Pastor Whitmore's teachings. The division was painful to watch, even from my distance. I'd spent 20 years in that community. Seeing it fracture was complicated grief, knowing I'd contributed to the destruction while understanding the truth had to emerge regardless of consequences. My therapist helped me process the cognitive dissonance of feeling both responsible and justified. Some things needed to break before they could heal correctly. Institutions built on exploitation couldn't be reformed gently. Pastor Whitmore's lawyer released a statement 6 weeks after the article published. He admitted to using congregational experiences as sermon inspiration, but denied deliberate exploitation, claiming he'd believed he had implicit consent through the pastoral relationship. He apologized if anyone felt violated by his methodology, but maintained he'd acted with pure motives to help others through shared struggles. The non-apology infuriated me. He'd made $15 million from our trauma and couldn't even acknowledge predatory behavior directly. His statement included announcement of stepping down from ministry to focus on family and healing. No admission of wrong counsel that endangered abuse victims. No acknowledgement of the business model built on mining vulnerable confessions. Just vague regret that people felt hurt. The church board accepted his resignation with praise for his years of service and commitment to handle the situation with grace and dignity. They offered a severance package worth $500,000. The institution protected itself and its leader even while admitting fault. Systemic accountability remained elusive despite our documentation and public exposure. I received a message from Pastor Whitmore's former assistant, Helen, who'd worked for him for 15 years before retiring. She wanted to meet privately, said she had information I needed to hear. We met at a quiet restaurant where she handed me a flash drive containing copies of every file from Pastor Whitmore's computer she'd maintained backup access to after retiring. "I knew something was wrong years ago," Helen said. "I saw him categorize confessions by potential sermon value. I watched him calculate which traumas would generate the best response. But I convinced myself he was doing God's work in unconventional ways. After reading your article, I couldn't live with staying silent anymore." The flash drive contained 20 years of notes systematically organizing congregational confessions by topic, emotional impact, and marketability. Spreadsheets tracked which stories generated highest attendance and donations. Draft sermons showed him experimenting with different angles on the same source confession to maximize engagement. The calculated nature of his exploitation was chilling in its documentation. This wasn't unconscious bias or poor boundaries. This was systematic predatory content mining with profit metrics. Helen cried as I reviewed the files on her laptop. I enabled this. I organized his calendar to maximize confession appointments before major sermon series deadlines. I'm so sorry. Armed with Helen's files, our lawyer advised we had grounds for a civil lawsuit against Pastor Whitmore for emotional distress, breach of fiduciary duty, and fraud. 12 of us decided to proceed, understanding the legal battle would drag for years. We filed jointly, including the new evidence from Helen's flash drive. Pastor Whitmore's legal team immediately moved to dismiss based on First Amendment protections for religious speech. The judge allowed the case to proceed, ruling that clergy relationships included fiduciary duties and that content mining confessions for profit potentially exceeded protected religious activity. The legal community watched closely as our case established precedent about boundaries between pastoral care and commercial exploitation. Media coverage intensified. The story evolved from local church scandal to national conversation about power dynamics in religious institutions. Advocacy groups used our case to push for legislation requiring clergy to obtain explicit consent before using congregational stories. Seminaries began teaching about ethical boundaries in pastoral counseling. The ripple effects exceeded anything I'd imagined when I walked into Pastor Whitmore's office to give him that final confession he couldn't monetize. The trial lasted 3 weeks with testimony from all 12 plaintiffs, plus expert witnesses on trauma, religious abuse, and fiduciary relationships. Pastor Whitmore's defense argued his sermon material was inspired by confessions, but sufficiently modified to protect privacy, that his counsel was protected religious activity, and that we'd participated willingly in the pastoral relationship. Our attorney dismantled each argument with Helen's files showing deliberate identification and categorization of our specific stories, with audio recordings of harmful counsel that endangered abuse victims, with financial records proving profit motive. The jury saw Pastor Whitmore's spreadsheets tracking which of our traumas generated highest donations. They heard Danielle describe being counseled to trust God through postpartum psychosis, while Pastor Whitmore prepared a sermon series about maternal failure. They watched video of Veronica explaining how she'd been told to tithe through bankruptcy, while Pastor Whitmore used her financial crisis as content for his stewardship teachings. The systematic exploitation was undeniable when presented comprehensively. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before finding in our favor on all counts. They awarded $12 million in damages, with punitive components recognizing the egregious nature of Pastor Whitmore's conduct. Pastor Whitmore filed for bankruptcy 3 months after the verdict. His assets were liquidated to pay the judgment, including the royalties from all books based on our confessions. The church attempted to distance itself from his actions while maintaining it had operated in good faith. Several board members resigned under pressure. The congregation continued shrinking as members confronted the reality of what their tithes had supported. Some left Christianity entirely, their faith too intertwined with Pastor Whitmore's teaching to survive his exposure. Others transferred to churches with stronger accountability structures. A small core group remained, committed to rebuilding with new leadership focused on actual pastoral care rather than platform building. The denomination launched an investigation into its credentialing and oversight processes, acknowledging systemic failures that enabled predatory behavior. Real institutional change progressed slowly, but the conversation we'd forced was bearing fruit beyond our specific situation. Churches nationwide reviewed their confidentiality policies, consent procedures, and power structures. The cost of speaking truth had been enormous, but the impact validated every difficult moment. My mother called 18 months after the trial ended. Her voice was different, smaller somehow. "I read your victim impact statement," she said. "I've been reading it repeatedly for months. I think I finally understand what I refused to see for 20 years. I'm sorry I chose protecting an institution over protecting my daughter. I'm sorry I made you doubt your own perceptions. I'm sorry I wasn't safe." The conversation lasted 2 hours. She couldn't undo decades of enabling Pastor Whitmore's exploitation or failing to protect me from Derek's violence. But hearing her acknowledge the truth without defensiveness or justification felt like oxygen after 20 years of suffocation. Healing relationships wasn't instant or complete, but it could begin when truth was finally possible. Some of the other women experienced similar family reconciliations as people who'd been deeply embedded in the church began processing what had actually happened. The cognitive dissonance couldn't be maintained forever when confronted with documented evidence and genuine accountability. Truth created space for authentic relationship to emerge from ashes of institutional loyalty. I started speaking at conferences about religious trauma, clergy abuse, and institutional accountability. My experience became a different kind of testimony, not filtered through someone else's agenda, but offered on my own terms. Organizations focused on preventing spiritual abuse invited me to train religious leaders on ethical boundaries and power dynamics. Seminaries included my story in case studies about pastoral misconduct. I wrote an article for a trauma recovery journal about recognizing exploitation disguised as care. The pain I'd endured still served a purpose, but now I controlled how my story was used. The difference was everything. Olivia's parents reached out after reading about the trial, thanking me for ensuring her death wasn't exploited anymore. They'd recognized her story in Pastor Whitmore's sermon series, but hadn't known how to address it until our lawsuit made the pattern public. They'd felt guilty relief when he could no longer profit from their daughter's loss. We cried together over coffee, sharing memories of her, acknowledging the violation of having her death commodified. They asked if I'd speak at an event they were organizing for drunk driving awareness, using our real story with consent to genuinely help others. I agreed. That's what redemption actually looked like, choosing truth over image, consent over exploitation, authentic care over calculated ministry. The church building sold to a tech company 2 years after Pastor Whitmore's resignation. The denomination dissolved the congregation, absorbing remaining members into neighboring churches. The physical structure that housed 20 years of my exploitation was gutted and converted to office space. I drove past it once during the renovation, watching construction crews tear out the sanctuary where I'd sat in the third row watching my pain become someone else's profit. The building's transformation felt appropriate somehow. What was built on exploitation couldn't maintain its original purpose once truth emerged. New foundations were necessary. Rebecca and I started a nonprofit providing resources for people leaving high-control religious environments. We offered free counseling connections, legal consultation, housing assistance, and community support. Funding came from speaking fees and donations from people who'd experienced similar abuse. The 12 women from the lawsuit all participated in various capacities, turning our collective trauma into genuine support structure for others. This was how testimony should function, offered freely with consent, creating space for healing rather than mining pain for content. We didn't build an empire. We built something smaller and real, focused on actual care rather than platform growth. 3 years after giving Pastor Whitmore that final confession he couldn't monetize, I testified before a state legislative committee considering clergy accountability legislation. The bill would require religious organizations to implement mandatory reporting for abuse, explicit consent procedures for using congregational stories, and oversight mechanisms for complaints against clergy. Religious liberty advocates opposed it as government overreach into church autonomy. I shared my experience of 20 years of exploitation enabled by lack of accountability structures. The committee passed the bill with bipartisan support. Governor signed it into law that summer. Other states began drafting similar legislation. The legal landscape around clergy conduct was shifting because we'd refused to stay silent. Change happened incrementally, imperfectly, but it happened. Our lawsuit established precedent used in subsequent cases across the country. The confession I'd given Pastor Whitmore about his own predatory behavior couldn't generate sermon content, but it generated something more valuable: truth that dismantled his exploitative system and created space for real accountability. I ran into Pastor Whitmore at a grocery store 4 years after everything imploded. He looked diminished somehow, gray hair unkempt, clothes ordinary instead of carefully curated. Our eyes met across the produce section. He opened his mouth like he might speak, then closed it and turned away. There was nothing left to say. He'd spent 20 years consuming my pain for profit. I'd spent 4 years ensuring he couldn't do that to anyone else. The transaction was complete. I finished my shopping and went home to my apartment filled with books I'd chosen, art I'd selected, a life I'd built without his approval or exploitation. My trauma wasn't material for someone else's ministry anymore. It was mine to process, mine to share or withhold, mine to transform on my own terms. That ownership was the real victory. Not revenge, not even justice, but autonomy finally reclaimed. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.